Historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the.
Hard times create strong people. What we observe historically, the men who not only provided for the women and children, who had to rebuild everything due to the repeat of history with blood, sweat, and tears, who defended their homelands with their lives, but we also observe the women who vicariously suffered the hardships of these men of old, without complaint or delusion. These women had their hearts broken as their men became ill and even died to create and protect civilization. They had their hearts broken when their children died in their arms, when they had no other options. There was a greater number of alpha males and females in the human gene pool who achieved these things. As the strong in mind, body, and soul survived and prospered, we observed higher critical thinking skills, superior preparedness, unmatched abilities to overcome, adapt, and move forward with the real hardships imposed. The rite of passage being clearly defined as lifetimes were not wasted. Factual-based common sense being praised. Equal opportunities were given with no luxury for excuse of failure, and prevailing failure was the only option. People raised adults and not children. Life was taken more seriously, and the moral compass was universal. Men and women respected each other for who they were, their roles in life, meeting on common ground of responsibilities. Privilege by all was earned, not given. Nothing was expected, even respect, as it was also earned. Hard work was rewarded, and there were no safe spaces for the weak. People lived life to its fullest. However, something changes, as it always has throughout human history.
Historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the.
Strong people create good times. What we observe historically, where the hardships to provide became lesser and lesser, the rebuilding of history almost achieved, thus the blood, sweat, and tears simply stories told. The need to defend homelands was now in the shadows, as the enemy was content where they were. But also now, the women only had stories of their own. How their grandmothers suffered vicariously as the heroic women of old. The men who became ill and even died to create and protect was less of an issue, as the luxuries of safety were made. These women still valued their children as the future, those who will progress on to better things. As the hardships became lesser and the fruits of men's labor flourished, they marveled at their achievements and began to raise themselves above that from which they came. Women began to have less worry, and their tasks became less. The human species grew in numbers, as did the fruits of their labor. More time became available to be at ease. The wealthy and the poor became murky, as abundance was all around them. Men still sacrificed themselves for the needs of the women and children. They continued to build and create, making the lives of their women easy. They provided what they did not have when they were children, to their children. Women started to become weak and began to expect, as the wealthy passed off their boredom to the lower ranks who consumed it all. The tradition, values, and social standards that created success was no longer good enough. They thought they could do better, thus dismissed the very things known to work, time-tested with the same positive results. Tolerance and acceptance of the lesser of the human gene pool was acceptable, allowing the population growth of the beta and omega males and females. It wasn't accepted as achievement. The complicating of the uncomplicated began to replace reality, and the concept of equal outcome over equal opportunity became the new social norm. Personal and social fluidity was glorified, allowing for carelessness of life. Now, the one who offered less to the human species began to expect, as the wealthy passed off their boredom to the lower ranks who consumed it all. However, something changes, as it always has throughout human history.
Historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the.
Good times created weak people. What we observed historically was men providing for women and children was made easy. Men providers were supplemented by glorified busybodies under the guise of good intentions, making men obsolete. By now, everything has been rebuilt to satisfactory standard, and enemy threats only rumored or offered as lies. Women did not have to suffer vicariously, had no stories of old to tell, thus fables were made. Women's boredom created wicked minds, and stories of old became skewed with nonsense. As the beta and omega females competed with the alpha females, men became casualties by being villainized, as so were the unborn children as they were murdered for inconvenience. With too much time came boredom, and allowing idle time to create the need of fulfillment. The rise of the busybody and the do-gooder with good intentions began to chip away at the catalyst of social cohesion. In the beginning, more laws were made to help unite the people, which turned into appeasing all the people. Wealth and inequality grew as corruption and lies became the new norm. Less tolerance and acceptance ran rampant throughout every part of society. The criminally insane, power-hungry seized the opportunity to gain full control and introduced nonsense and divisions between all. As the people found themselves lost, they began to create new false traditions, values, and standards, as well as belief systems, replacing God. The time of the great forgetting of old has now firmly taken over, as the ignorance of history and their present via arrogant falsehood rewrites who they were, are, and will be. Nothing is defined, no more rite of passage, no more what is criminal or moral, nothing is clear. They began to lose respect for self and others. Theories and opinions are accepted as fact, equal outcome now expected at all costs. The beta and omega males reign as the majority, making the men who achieve so much obsolete. Women with too much time welcome the comfort of the new dominant male and say, yes, we are equal to them. The children that survived pre-birth murder were being raised to be children under the guise of compassion. Thus the crybaby grew into the tattletale, who grew into the bully, who grew into the busybody, who grew into the social justice snowflake, who obtained positions of authority as glorified busybodies. Oh, if only the people of old can see what has become. However, something changes, as it always has throughout human history.
Historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the.
Weak people create hard times. What we observe historically, the beginning of the end of civilization, as the glorified busybodies who replaced men for providing and protecting became so corrupt, their own corruption was their fall. No one was left to provide for the women and children. The governing laws became as theoretical mathematics, with neither having a place in reality. The wet noodle men of majority did not have the testicular fortitude to achieve anything for themselves, let alone for anyone else. What was rebuilt began to crumble and fall to ruins, and the enemy who held stronger to the traditions, values, and standards of old was now at the front door, offering solutions via the illusion of acceptance of diversity, or by the sword with fear, with either end result being the same. And the women who once vicariously suffered, who once shared stories of old, who once skewed with nonsense, now have none of these things, but embrace regret, for as they watch their creation of social decay consume all they once loved and cherished. The people now see the progression of their demise. First it was their boredom and discontentment, followed by the others who always had their respect with conditions, to the rest who went against all that was natural and good. They now see all had their place, at times with real tolerance but with conditions, as conditions was discipline, and discipline being freedom. They watch as they began to remember the stories of old, skewed with arrogance and clouded with time. But it's too late by now. With nothing left but to make the natural criminal and the unnatural normal, to make the strength of old immoral and weakness a good thing, to demand safety from themselves while pointing their fingers around them, social decay begins to rot civilization from the inside. From the ground up, from where this began, self-destruction of men to men, women to women, and children to children, from women to men and men to women, from the children to their mothers and fathers, and their mothers and fathers to their children. Political correctness causing chaos, with the falsehood of from chaos comes order. Many seek salvation from any source that presents itself. Hero worship of famous characters, imagined or not, fulfilled the void that times of old had. Fear grows into paranoia, more confusion takes hold. Soon follows sickness and death, and everything built by men crumbles to dust. Now, the great remembering begins, and forgiveness of God, the elders, and ancestors is cried for, with promises made. Praying for a second chance via a new equilibrium being established is embraced with tears. And behold, yet another chance seen across the plane of the earth. Hard times create strong people. What we observe historically, the men who not only provided for the women and children, who had to rebuild everything due to the repeat of history with blood, sweat, and tears, but we also observe the women who vicariously suffered the hardships of these men of old, without complaint or delusion. The time of the great remembering of old has now firmly taken over, and future stories in the making.
Historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the